Before my only daughter walked down the aisle, I stopped by a custom suit shop in downtown Dallas for a fitting. Without warning, the shop owner, a man I'd trusted for decades, grabbed my arm and shoved me into a dark dressing room. He leaned in, his voice barely a whisper. "Something you need to know. Stay right here. Don't say a word. Trust me." I was completely blindsided, but I stayed quiet. A few minutes later, through the thin wood paneling, I heard something that made me freeze. My blood turned to ice. "My name is Harrison Gallagher. I'm 70 years old. I'm a retired structural engineer who spent 40 years building skyscrapers all across Texas. I know how to spot the smallest hairline fracture in a foundation before the whole building comes crashing down. But God help me, it wasn't until I was standing in the dark of that dressing room, listening to my future son-in-law calmly orchestrating the end of my only child, that I realized there was a fatal crack in my own family. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and make sure to subscribe to hear how I dismantled every single piece of this monster's life. It was a Tuesday, 4 days before the wedding. My daughter Maya is the center of my universe. Ever since my wife Martha passed away 7 years ago, Maya is all I have left. She's 32, she runs her own art gallery, and she looked so happy it was blinding. She was engaged to Preston Cole. Preston is 35, drives a flashy European sports car, and wears expensive designer clothes. He claimed to be a wealthy tech investor from the East Coast. He was smooth, maybe a little too polished, but the way Maya looked at him, it was like he'd hung the moon for her. As a father, when you see your daughter shining with that kind of pure joy, you try to put your cynicism aside. I wanted to believe he was a good man. I even covered the entire bill for the wedding at a high-end country club, because I wanted to give her the world. That Tuesday, I drove my truck to Dominic Rossi's shop. Dominic is a master tailor and a close friend of 25 years. When I pushed the glass door open, the bell chimed, and Dominic looked up from a roll of silk. The color drained from his face instantly. He rushed over, flipped the sign to closed, and threw the deadbolt. Before I could ask what was going on, he grabbed my shoulders and practically shoved me to the back of the store. He pushed me into the VIP fitting room with the heavy velvet curtains and thick mahogany walls. He stared right into my eyes, his hands shaking violently. He told me to stay in the dark and no matter what I heard, not to make a sound. He shut the door and locked it from the outside. I was furious and totally confused. I almost pounded on the door, thinking my old friend had finally lost it. But then I heard the front door unlock and open. The bell chimed again, footsteps echoed on the hardwood, 2 sets. I recognized the voices immediately. It was Preston, my future son-in-law, and Valerie. Valerie is Preston's sister and his supposed business partner. She'd flown into town a week ago to help with the wedding preparations. They walked right past my dressing room and stopped in the lounge area, separated from me by nothing but an inch of decorative wood. I stood in the pitch black, holding my breath, waiting to hear whatever emergency could make Dominic lock me up like a criminal. I thought maybe Preston was in financial trouble or had some petty scandal he was hiding. I'm a practical man. I was ready to fix whatever it was. But I was absolutely not prepared to face pure evil. Preston spoke first, his voice stripped of that charming, respectful tone he always used with me and Maya. He let out a low, arrogant laugh that made my stomach turn. He told Valerie they didn't need to look at any fabric samples today. He said, "The old man is a complete fool. He'll sign the medical power of attorney at the rehearsal dinner, thinking it's just standard paperwork for a tax-sheltered trust." I pressed my ear against the cold wood, frowning in the dark. We had talked about a family trust to protect Maya's inheritance, but a medical power of attorney was never part of the original plan. Why would Preston need control over Maya's medical decisions? Valerie answered, her voice cold as a blade. She told Preston that was excellent. She said, Once the ink is dry on that document, that $10 million life insurance policy goes into full effect. Then she said the words that made my heart stop in my chest. She said, "Maya isn't coming back from that hiking trip in the Swiss Alps. It's going to be a tragic accident, and you'll be the grieving widower with all the chips." Preston chuckled again, a sick, terrifying sound. He agreed, saying it was the perfect plan. The air in my lungs turned to ash. I felt like my legs were about to buckle. My mind flashed back to the honeymoon plans. Preston had been adamant about booking a remote, high-altitude hiking expedition in Switzerland, claiming it would be a romantic adventure. My beautiful Maya hates the cold and has zero experience climbing, but she agreed just to make him happy. He was planning to remove her from the picture, and he needed my legal consent so that if she ended up in a foreign hospital on life support, I wouldn't be able to intervene. They stayed in the shop for 5 agonizing minutes, calmly discussing how to liquidate my real estate portfolio, once they had control of my daughter's estate. Every word they dropped was like a sledgehammer hitting the foundations of my entire life. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. I let the absolute darkness of that room swallow my shock, and I carefully turned it into cold, pure fury. I heard the shop door chime as they finally stepped out into the sunshine. Dominic opened my door immediately. He was sweating, looking at me with absolute sympathy and fear. I didn't say a word to him. I just gripped his shoulder in silent gratitude and walked straight out the front door. I climbed into my truck, gripping the leather steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I didn't call the police. I didn't have a recording. I only had my word, and I knew Maya was completely under his spell. I drove through the Dallas traffic straight to my daughter's apartment building. The anger burning in my chest was a living, breathing monster. I was going to kick her front door off the hinges. I was going to tear Preston apart piece by piece until he confessed to everything. To any parent listening, never let the fear of pushing your child away stop you from trusting your gut. Predators don't wear warning labels. They disguise themselves as everything your child ever wanted. They use charm as a weapon and isolation as a tool. If someone enters your family and the dynamic suddenly turns toxic, if your child changes or starts pulling away, don't be polite. Investigate. Ask the tough questions. Gather your evidence in the dark. Be the villain in their eyes for a month, but that is infinitely better than mourning them for the rest of your life. If you believe this story proves that a father's love is the ultimate shield, hit that like button. Subscribe for more stories about survival and justice. Tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I'll see you in the next one. I pulled the truck onto the curb, ignoring the fire lane signs. My boots thundered across the lobby floor as I bypassed the front desk. I stepped into the elevator and slammed the button for the penthouse. My chest was heaving. The doors slid open, and I didn't even bother to knock. I shoved the oak door open, and it hit the wall with a deafening crack. Maya gasped, dropping a stack of wedding invitations onto the hardwood. Preston was sitting on the modern leather sofa, sipping a sparkling water. He didn't flinch. He didn't jump. He just looked at me with those cold, empty eyes. They were the eyes of a predator, calmly analyzing its prey. I crossed the living room in 3 strides. I pointed my finger right in his face and told him I knew exactly what he was planning. I grilled him about the medical power of attorney. I questioned him about the $10 million insurance policy and the sudden decision to go hiking in the Swiss Alps. I turned to Maya, begging her to leave him, pleading with her to believe that he and that sister of his were planning to hurt her. I expected him to crumble, to stutter, or to try and fight me right there in the living room. Instead, Preston did the most terrifying thing imaginable. He sighed, set his glass on the coffee table, and looked at Maya with an expression of deep hurt and sympathy. He stood up slowly, opening his hands in a gesture of total surrender. When he spoke, his voice was so smooth, so perfectly tuned, that it made me feel sick. He calmly stated that he understood why I was confused, completely brushing off my rage. He walked over to his leather briefcase on the kitchen counter and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. He spread them out on the island, smoothing the crisp paper with his manicured hands. He turned to Maya, touched her arm to soothe her, and then looked right at me. He explained, with infinite patience, that trust fund documents were standard procedure for high-net-worth families getting married. He talked about my commercial real estate portfolio in Dallas, saying Maya was facing a massive tax burden. He threw around complex financial jargon with the precision of a seasoned corporate lawyer. He claimed the medical power of attorney was just a standard clause his lawyer automatically added to ensure Maya would be protected if anything happened to me, not the other way around. He twisted the narrative so perfectly that, for a split second, I actually doubted my own sanity. Then I brought up the $10 million life insurance policy. I shouted that it was a motive for murder. Preston didn't raise his voice. He reached back into his briefcase and produced a letter from a bank. He looked at Maya with absolute devotion and explained that the policy was a mandatory requirement from a private bank to secure the mortgage on a Beverly Hills estate he was buying for their future together. He said it was a financial safety net to ensure that if anything ever happened to him, Maya would never be burdened with debt. He made it sound so romantic. He made it sound like the ultimate move of a man providing for his family. As for the Swiss Alps, he smiled gently and reminded Maya that it was supposed to be a surprise. He explained it was a highly regulated luxury tour with professional guides and Sherpas, not some dangerous solo climb. He played the victim with chilling perfection. He looked at me with sad eyes and calmly asked why I hated him so much that I would invent a murder conspiracy just days before the happiest moment of their lives. I turned to my daughter in desperation, hoping she could see through his smooth lies. I begged her to listen to me, trying to tell her about Dominic, the tailor shop, and the terrifying conversation I just overheard. But when I looked into Maya's eyes, I didn't see the little girl I had raised and protected. I saw a stranger, completely consumed by a carefully constructed illusion. Her face flushed a deep, burning crimson with pure, unadulterated rage. Her hands were trembling, but the look in her eyes wasn't fear. It was total, biting fury. She stepped right up to Preston, shielding him from my anger. She told me I had completely lost my mind. Her voice cracked when she brought up her mother, saying that ever since Martha passed 7 years ago, I'd become paranoid, stifling, and obsessively controlling. She accused me of trying to sabotage her happiness because I was terrified of being alone in my old age. Every word she threw at me was like a dagger, aimed perfectly at my deepest emotional wound. I tried to speak, to explain the ice in Valerie's voice and the sheer, calculated malice I'd heard behind that wood paneling. But Maya held up a stiff hand, refusing to hear another syllable. She said I'd spent my entire life building cold, lifeless steel structures, and now I was trying to tear down the only beautiful thing she'd built for herself. She was crying, hurting, telling me that Preston had done nothing but support and love her unconditionally, while I was acting like a delusional old man trying to ruin her future. The look of betrayal in her eyes was devastating. She pointed a shaking finger at the open door of the penthouse. She screamed that I was destroying her life and sabotaging her wedding. She told me to leave and not to come back until I was ready to apologize and accept the man she loved. I stood there looking at both of them. Preston wrapped his arms around her shoulders and kissed her head while she sobbed against his chest. Over her shaking shoulder, he looked straight at me. A slow, chilling, triumphant smirk crawled across his face. It was the undeniable sneer of a man who knew he'd just won the first battle. In that moment, I realized that confronting him out in the open would only push Maya deeper into his deadly trap. If I kept pushing, she'd cut me off completely, and then she'd be gone, lost to those freezing mountains. I turned around and walked slowly out of the apartment, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind me. I stood all alone in the quiet, carpeted hallway. I had been cut off by my only child. I had absolutely zero evidence to hand over to the police, and I had no allies left in her life. But I knew the absolute terrifying truth. If Preston wanted to play a shadow game to steal my legacy and hurt my daughter, he was about to find out just how cold and ruthless a father with nothing left to lose can be. I walked to the elevator, a new plan forming in my mind. I was going to systematically dismantle his entire existence, bit by bit, until there was nowhere left in this world for him to hide. I spent a sleepless night staring at the ceiling, forcing my bruised pride to bow to cold, hard logic. Every engineer knows that if you attack a solid wall head-on, you only break your own tools. You have to find the stress point. To do that, you need access. The next morning, I picked up my phone and did the hardest thing I'd ever done. I called my daughter and I lied. I forced my voice to shake. I made myself sound small, broken, and ancient. I apologized frantically for my outburst. I blamed my behavior on the grief of losing her mother, claiming that the thought of giving her away had triggered a panic attack. I swallowed my pride and begged for her forgiveness. Maya hesitated, a hint of suspicion in her voice, but her heart was fundamentally kind. She sighed, her tone softening, and invited me to brunch at the country club on Sunday to clear the air. She said Preston had encouraged her to give me another chance. I thanked her and hung up, feeling a cold, steely resolve seep into my marrow. Sunday morning arrived with brilliant sunshine. I walked onto the country club terrace wearing a perfectly tailored suit and the mask of a repentant elder. Maya, Preston, and Valerie were sitting at a table overlooking the 18th hole. I approached with an apologetic smile, playing the part of a lesson-learned senior who finally knew his place. Preston stood up to greet me. His expression radiated a smug, magnanimous sense of victory. He played the gracious winner perfectly, pulling out my chair and ordering me a coffee. Valerie sat beside him, sipping a mimosa, her eyes tracking every move I made with clinical precision. I sat down, unfolded my napkin, and shifted my mindset entirely. I stopped talking and started observing. I shut down the part of my brain that was screaming to choke the life out of Preston and activated my engineering mind. I began looking for the hairline fractures in their disguise. Preston dominated the conversation. He went on at length about his wealthy upbringing in Boston, skillfully dropping names of elite boarding schools and exclusive yacht clubs. He rested his left arm on the white tablecloth, prominently displaying a gold vintage Rolex. He caught me looking at it and proudly declared it a family heirloom passed down from his grandfather, an industrial tycoon. From a distance, it was a beautiful timepiece, but my eyes were trained to spot errors of a few millimeters on a steel beam from 50 yards away. As he reached for his water glass, the sunlight hit the watch face perfectly. I watched the second hand. On a true vintage mechanical Rolex, the second hand sweeps in a smooth, continuous motion. But Preston's watch didn't sweep. It ticked, a stiff, distinct jerk every second. It was a quartz movement. The watch was a cheap, mass-produced fake, wrapped in nothing but a layer of shiny gold plating. Just like the man wearing it, it was a total fraud. A hairline crack in the foundation had just been exposed. My mind raced, filing that detail away while I nodded along to his made-up family history. A few minutes later, the waiter brought our plates. As I adjusted my silverware, I intentionally bumped my cloth napkin off my lap. It fluttered to the stone floor. I bent down to retrieve it, my gaze lingering under the table for a fraction of a second. What I saw made my blood run cold. Valerie, the woman introduced to the world as his sister, had slipped off her high heel. Her bare foot was resting high on Preston's inner thigh, her toes slowly and intimately caressing his leg. It was an unmistakably sexual, intensely intimate act that no sister would ever perform. They were relaxed, confident in their ruse, believing the foolish old man sitting across the table was blind to their game. I sat back up, keeping my face blank, but my heart was hammering a dangerous rhythm against my ribs. I turned my attention to Maya. Throughout the entire brunch, my vibrant, energetic daughter barely spoke 3 words. She was slumped in her chair, her posture completely gone. Her skin, usually glowing and healthy, was ash gray, with a sickly, almost translucent quality. She stared at her untouched food with hollow, unfocused eyes. When the waiter asked if she needed a refill, she blinked several times, struggling to process the simple question. Preston stepped in immediately, placing a gentle but controlling hand over hers and answering for her with a smooth charm. He claimed she was just exhausted from wedding planning and needed rest. Maya just nodded, a slow, robotic movement, and leaned her heavy head on his shoulder. The horrific truth hit me like a freight train. She wasn't just tired. She was in a state of deep lethargy, being kept sedated. The conversation I'd overheard in the tailor shop roared in my mind. They were systemically drugging her. They had her trapped in a chemical fog to stop her from noticing any red flags and to ensure she'd blindly sign whatever documents they put in front of her. Every protective instinct in my body was screaming at me to stand up, flip the table, and drag my daughter out of that club immediately. I wanted to scream for the police, demand a blood test, and expose them to the entire dining room. But my engineering mind ruthlessly suppressed my emotions, stopping me before I could make a fatal mistake. If I called the police right now, what would happen? I had no physical evidence. I only had a fake watch and a fleeting glimpse under a table. Maya, under the heavy influence of whatever toxins they were feeding her, would undoubtedly defend Preston. The police would just see a dramatic family dispute, a father making wild accusations against a beloved fiancé. They'd leave and Preston would immediately realize the depth of my suspicion. He'd speed up his timeline. He'd take Maya far away, cut off all my access, and execute his murder plan where I'd never be able to reach them. I realized that acting on impulse was the same as signing my daughter's death warrant. I couldn't rely on gut feelings or circumstantial observations. I needed hard, undeniable facts. I needed bank records, toxicology reports, and a trail of deception that no lawyer, police officer, or judge could ignore. I needed devastating proof. For the rest of the brunch, I played my assigned role to perfection. I smiled, laughed off Preston's fake jokes, and kissed Maya's pale cheek as we said goodbye in the parking lot. I watched as Preston guided her into his sports car, a false prince leading a captured princess into an expertly designed trap. I waved goodbye with a gentle, apologetic smile that stayed on my face until their car disappeared around the bend. The second they were out of sight, the smile vanished. I walked back to my truck, my mind already calculating the complex geometry of their destruction. The shadow game had begun, and I was going to tear their world to shreds. Early the next morning, I drove to the main branch of my bank in downtown Dallas. I wore a plain jacket and a baseball cap, keeping my head down as I bypassed the main teller line. I walked straight into the private wealth management office and sat across from my personal banker. I told him I needed exactly $100,000 in untraceable cash. He looked at me with concern, gently asking if I was in trouble. I forced a tired smile and told him I was making a highly confidential investment in a private venture. He didn't ask again. An hour later, I walked out of the bank with a heavy leather duffel bag slung over my shoulder, the weight of the stacks of bills pressed against my side. After leaving the bank, I drove to an unassuming office building on the industrial edge of the city. I wasn't looking for a common private investigator who only took photos of cheating spouses. I needed a ghost. I needed someone who operated entirely in the dark and understood the mechanics of corporate financial fraud. I carefully called in old favors and contacts in the commercial construction industry who handled corporate espionage, and everyone gave me the same name, Victor Thorne. Victor was a former federal financial investigator who'd been forced out of the agency a decade ago for his cold, ruthless tactics. He didn't care about the red tape of the law. He only cared about results. I walked into his sparsely furnished office and dropped the heavy leather bag directly onto his metal desk. I pulled the zipper open to reveal the stacks of $100 bills. Victor barely blinked. He leaned back in his creaky chair and asked who we were destroying today. I told him everything. I described the conversation at the tailor shop, the fake watch, the suspicious legal documents, and my daughter's terrifying physical state. Victor listened in a silence of absolute, calculated calm. When I finished, he just nodded, pulled a clean notepad from his drawer, and told me we were going to track every breath this man had ever taken. Before Victor and I could make our move, I needed to create a massive diversion. I needed Preston to feel total victory and absolute safety. I drove home, packed a large golf bag, and intentionally called Maya. As I put the clubs in the trunk, I made sure my voice sounded completely defeated, playing the part of a broken father who had finally accepted defeat. I told her our terrible argument had pushed me to the breaking point, and that I was letting my grief for her mother ruin the most important week of her life. I said I was flying to a secluded golf resort in Florida to cool off and clear my head so I could be ready to walk her down the aisle with a genuine smile. Preston was in the background. I could hear him urging Maya to put the phone on speaker. He chimed in, his voice dripping with false, syrupy concern. He told me it was a brilliant idea, assuring me that Florida was exactly what I needed to relax. He promised to take perfect care of Maya while I was gone, telling me to focus on my golf swing and let them handle the rest of the wedding stress. I swallowed the bile rising in my throat. I thanked him, told Maya I loved her more than my own life, and hung up the phone. Preston thought he'd successfully banished the annoying old man to a golf course 1,000 miles away. He had made a fatal mistake. I didn't fly to Florida. I drove to a private airfield outside of Dallas, where Victor had chartered an untraceable light jet using a corporate shell account. We boarded in total silence, bringing only 2 small duffel bags and 2 heavy laptops. As the jet climbed into the sky, banking sharply toward the East Coast, Victor laid out the wedding invitation Preston was so proud of. The thick, beige cardstock featured a beautiful family crest and their family's elegant return address. Preston had bragged endlessly about his generational wealth, claiming his family owned a sprawling historic estate in one of Boston's most exclusive old money neighborhoods. At the rehearsal dinner, he'd fabricated complex stories about growing up in a massive stone mansion with manicured gardens and luxury cars. He said his parents were traveling in Europe and would be flying directly into Dallas just before the rehearsal dinner. It was a perfectly constructed narrative designed to make my daughter feel like she was marrying into royalty. But as Victor hammered away at his laptop, tunneling into restricted databases using backdoors the feds thought they'd shuttered years ago, the cracks in Preston's facade began to multiply. Victor pulled up property tax records, municipal utility bills, and zoning permits. The Boston address on that wedding invitation didn't belong to the Cole family. In fact, there hasn't been a wealthy Cole family in that prestigious zip code for the last 50 years. We landed under a gray, somber Boston sky. The air was biting, piercing through my thin jacket, but I could barely feel it. We rented a nondescript sedan and drove straight into the heart of the city. I navigated the narrow, winding streets, gripping the wheel until my knuckles ached, the GPS guiding us closer and closer to that elegant address. My heart was hammering a relentless rhythm against my ribs. We left the affluent, tree-lined boulevards behind and drifted into a decaying industrial strip. The grand historic mansions with sprawling lawns were quickly replaced by cracked sidewalks and towering chain-link fences. At the exact coordinates Preston had presented to the world as his family estate, I pulled the sedan to a slow crawl. I shifted into park, staring through the windshield, locked in a state of absolute, horrifying disbelief. There was no historic stone estate, no manicured gardens, no grand library. The address belonged to a dilapidated, abandoned strip club and shopping center. The windows were boarded up with rotting plywood, covered in peeling graffiti and faded gang tags. The parking lot was a sea of weeds and cracked asphalt, littered with broken glass and rusted shopping carts. The specific unit number listed as his family estate was nothing more than the storefront of a defunct discount liquor store. Its faded awning sagged dangerously, nearly touching the ground. Victor sat in the passenger seat, his dark eyes locked onto the absolute desolation in front of us. He slowly closed his heavy laptop and turned to look at me. The silence in the small car was thick and suffocating, and the terrifying scale of the entire fraud left me gasping for air. Preston wasn't some wealthy tech investor from old money. The man currently sleeping next to my heavily sedated daughter, the man systematically preparing to take full control of her entire life, did not exist. The upcoming wedding was a total lie, and Preston was an absolute, terrifying ghost. Victor didn't waste a second staring at the ruinous building. He flipped his laptop back open, the pale light of the screen casting long shadows over his focused face. His fingers flew across the keyboard with a trained, terrifying speed. He bypassed standard public directories, diving straight into municipal tax filings and property ownership archives. He linked the address of that abandoned liquor store to a network of obscure shell companies. The layers of deception were incredibly dense, meticulously designed to frustrate any standard background check. But Victor wasn't a standard investigator. He was a predator who lived to hunt down financial criminals. I sat motionless in the driver's seat, silently listening to the rapid, rhythmic clatter of his keys, my eyes fixed on the rotting plywood covering the storefront. The damp, freezing Boston air seeped through the windows, but a searing, suffocating rage radiated within my chest. Victor broke the silence, his voice a low, steady hum. He explained that the shell companies registered at this address were dead ends on paper, but each one had a registered agent and a bank routing number, seemingly used to pay minimum state filing fees. He ran that routing number through a specialized financial database, tracking the source of the funds. A dazzling waterfall of bank records, wire transfers, and offshore accounts began to cascade across the screen. It was a complex web of stolen funds, laundered through virtual company funnels. Victor pointed to a specific series of transactions. He showed me how the money was systematically scrubbed and redirected to a high-yield checking account in Dallas. That one account was the lifeline of his fictional existence. It paid for the European sports car. It paid for the custom suits. It funded lavish dinners at five-star restaurants and the illusion of a wildly successful tech investor. Every penny of his charming lifestyle was violently squeezed from the accounts of unknown victims and funneled through this decaying shopping center. I stared at the glowing screen, watching numbers representing millions in stolen dollars slide across the dark display. A sickening wave of revulsion rose in my throat. I rested my head against the cold glass of the car window and closed my eyes. My mind instantly flashed back to the sweltering, relentless heat of a Texas summer. I remembered the 40 years I'd spent building my real estate portfolio. I didn't inherit a single cent. I started as a junior structural engineer, wearing steel-toed boots and a hard hat, walking construction sites while the concrete was still wet and the temperature soared past 100 degrees. I volunteered for 80-hour weeks of grueling labor, missing countless family dinners, school plays, and weekend ball games, simply because I was absolutely determined to build an unbreakable foundation for my wife and daughter. I remembered the physical toll it took. The permanent pain in my lower back, the calluses on my hands that never quite faded, the countless nights I spent at the kitchen table, agonizing over blueprints and supply budgets. I poured real sweat and blood into the Dallas soil to create a legacy of security and respect. I built skyscrapers that touched the sky, structures designed to withstand the brutal forces of nature. I did all of this so Maya would never have to experience the crushing weight of poverty or the desperate fear of instability. And now, sitting in this cold, rented car, I was forced to look at the exact opposite of everything I stood for. He was a parasite. He was a hollow, worthless shell of a man who had created absolutely nothing of value. He didn't build. He didn't create. He just hunted for innocents who had worked their whole lives, who were dangerously trusting and highly vulnerable. He systematically sucked their financial accounts dry. He was trying to hijack 40 years of my relentless sacrifice overnight. He wanted to take the empire I'd built for my daughter and use it to fund his pathetic criminal vanity. The absolute audacity of his parasitic existence made my blood boil with lethal intensity. I opened my eyes, the grief burned away, leaving only a rock-hard, calculated resolve. I wasn't just going to expose him. I was going to tear him apart piece by piece. Victor let out a sharp, sudden breath. The rapid clattering of his keyboard stopped instantly. He leaned closer to the monitor, squinting to read a document that had just decrypted. The ambient light from the screen illuminated a sudden shift in his expression. The usual detached professionalism of the former Fed was replaced by genuine, raw shock. He shook his head slowly, muttering under his breath about how remarkably sloppy this guy was for someone playing such a high-stakes game. I demanded to know what he'd found. I reached across the center console, my eyes scanning the complex blocks of text on his screen. Victor pulled up a digitized police record from a precinct in Nevada dating back over a decade. He explained that by cross-referencing the source accounts with old arrest warrants for wire fraud, he'd finally managed to bypass the fake identities. Preston Cole didn't exist. It was an alias created 4 years ago. His real name was Thomas Vance. He was a convicted con man who'd already served 3 years in a medium-security state prison for ruthlessly orchestrating a massive real estate scheme, specifically targeting vulnerable, elderly widows. He had a documented history of financial predation. My chest tightened. The man sleeping beside my daughter was a convicted felon. But Victor wasn't finished. His fingers began to move across the keyboard again, even faster this time. He opened a separate browser window, accessing a deeply restricted public records database. He entered the real name, Thomas Vance, along with the name Valerie Cross, referencing their past residential addresses and known associates. A progress bar loaded on the screen, stretching the agonizing tension in the small, silent vehicle. Suddenly, a high-resolution scan appeared on the monitor. It was an official state record with raised seals and a series of clear signatures. Victor downloaded the file and opened it full screen. He stared at it for a long, heavy second. He closed his eyes slowly, let out a deep, heavy sigh, and then slammed his silver laptop shut. The sudden, sharp noise echoed in the small space of the vehicle like a gunshot. He turned his head and looked me straight in the eyes. His voice was stripped of any emotion, cold and absolute. He told me to brace myself. He laid his right hand flat on top of the closed laptop and whispered the exact words that were about to officially trigger the total, irreversible destruction of the reality my beloved daughter had carefully constructed. "Harrison," he said, his voice dropping to a gravelly tone. "They aren't brother and sister." I stared at Victor, the damp chill of the Boston evening fading, replaced by a cold numbness in my chest. I made him repeat what he just said. Victor didn't repeat it. Instead, He tapped the laptop screen, zooming in on the scanned document until the text filled the display. I leaned over the center console, scanning the heavily watermarked paper. It was a marriage certificate issued in Clark County, Nevada. The stamped date at the top showed it had been filed exactly 8 years ago. My gaze moved down to the signatures at the bottom. The first signature belonged to Thomas Vance, the convicted felon I'd called Preston Cole. The second signature belonged to Valerie Vance, the woman currently staying in my daughter's guest room, eating our food and playing the role of his loving, supportive sister. They weren't siblings, they were legally bound, husband and wife. The sheer depravity of their deception hit me like a heavy physical blow. My mind flashed back to the brunch at the country club, to the horrific image of Valerie's bare foot rubbing against Preston's inner thigh under the white tablecloth, while my beautiful, sedated daughter sat right across from them. Victor kept his voice low and steady, analyzing the situation with the cold precision of an experienced investigator. He explained that we were dealing with a highly organized, extremely experienced scam ring. He pulled up an auxiliary file that outlined a pattern of behavior that made my blood run cold. This was their modus operandi. They systematically searched for wealthy, emotionally vulnerable women. They targeted those who were isolated or in grief, desperately craving love and validation. Preston would assume a meticulously crafted false identity, playing the role of the perfect, charming suitor. He would sweep the target off her feet with lavish attention and fabricated wealth. Meanwhile, Valerie would insert herself into the dynamic as the protective but warm sister, providing a false sense of family stability to complete the complex illusion. Once the trap was set, and the victim was completely isolated from her real family and friends, they would strike without mercy or hesitation. But this time, Victor pointed out, his eyes dark and grave, the stakes are infinitely higher. Maya isn't just a wealthy target with a healthy savings account. Maya is the sole heir to the commercial real estate empire I spent 40 years building from the dirt. More importantly, she's about to be tied to a newly signed $10 million life insurance policy. They weren't just planning to steal her money, take my property and run. They were planning to steal my entire legacy, and then, to cash in the final prize, execute my only child in the freezing mountains of Switzerland. I leaned back into the stiff fabric of the passenger seat, struggling to pull oxygen into my burning lungs. I'd spent a lifetime calculating load-bearing walls, assessing stress points, and reinforcing foundations with solid steel. I knew how to protect buildings against hurricanes and earthquakes, but nothing could have prepared me for the structural collapse of my own family. The monsters were in the house. They were sleeping under my daughter's roof, slowly poisoning her body and mind with whatever toxic cocktail they were secretly slipping into her daily routine. I closed my eyes, fighting back a sudden, overwhelming urge to weep. I couldn't afford the luxury of grief or panic. Maya needed an engineer right now. She needed a father capable of building a trap so devastating and airtight that these parasites would never live to see tomorrow. Victor interrupted my thoughts, asking how we should proceed. He suggested we take this newly discovered marriage certificate straight to the local authorities, hoping they would arrest Preston based on the outstanding warrants or parole violations under Thomas Vance's real name. I shook my head, my jaw set with absolute, unshakable resolve. I told Victor that an arrest for an old wire fraud charge would only keep Thomas Vance locked up for a few months. Valerie would bail him out, and then they would vanish into the wind, gone forever. I needed them to face legal consequences for attempted murder before I could ensure Maya's safety. I needed to expose their ongoing conspiracy in a way that left absolutely no room for legal maneuvering or lenient plea deals. I told Victor we were sticking to the original plan. We had to make them walk straight into the trap at the rehearsal dinner. Just as I finished speaking, A sudden vibration from my phone startled us both. It buzzed loudly in the cup holder between the two seats. I picked it up, looking at the bright screen with hands that were shaking slightly. It was a text from Maya. A lump of agony rose in my throat at the sight of her name. I quickly unlocked the phone and opened the message, expecting a brief update or perhaps another defensive argument about our terrible fight. Instead, the words I read made the blood freeze in my veins once again. Maya wrote, "Pre says my vitamins are making me dizzy, so we're moving the Swiss Alps trip up by 2 days. We're leaving as soon as our reception ends." I read the text a second time, then a third, my eyes locked onto the glowing white letters. Preston was accelerating his timeline. He knew the heavy sedatives and beta blockers he was feeding her were causing visible damage. He knew she was becoming dangerously weak, perhaps too weak to make it through a long wedding reception. Or maybe he'd sensed the sudden shift in my demeanor during brunch and realized his window of absolute safety was closing rapidly. Whatever his reasoning, he was panicking. He was manipulating her into leaving the country immediately after the reception, completely bypassing the 2-day buffer we'd originally planned. He was taking her out of U.S. territory, away from my protection, away from U.S. law enforcement, at a speed much faster than I'd anticipated. I handed the phone to Victor. He read the brief message in silence, his jaw tight. He looked at me, confirming the terrifying reality of our new situation. The window of time we had to strike back had just violently closed by 48 hours. We didn't have time to prepare our evidence for the authorities. We were now operating on an incredibly dangerous, highly compressed timeline. The rehearsal dinner was no longer just the final piece of the trap. It was the absolute deadline. If I couldn't stop them there, if I failed to execute the plan perfectly, Maya would be boarding a private plane to Europe at midnight, and I would never see my daughter alive again. I took a deep, shuddering breath, the cold Boston air filling my lungs. I turned the key and the heavy engine roared to life. I shifted the heavy rental car into drive. I had less than 72 hours to save her life. The countdown echoed in my mind. There was absolutely no time to process the sickening reality of the marriage certificate or the depth of their deception. I looked at Victor in the cold rental car and told him we needed to be back in Texas before sundown. We abandoned the discount strip mall in Boston and drove back to the private airfield. The flight to Dallas was spent in agonizing silence. I mapped out the layout of the penthouse in my mind, calculating visual blind spots and preparing myself. I was no longer just an angry father trying to protect his daughter. I was an engineer dismantling an enemy structure from the inside. When the wheels touched the tarmac in Texas, Victor opened his laptop and accessed the cellular tracking software he used to locate financial fugitives. Within minutes, he confirmed that Preston and Maya were at a bakery on the other side of town for a final cake tasting. Valerie was registered to be picking up final alterations at a bridal boutique. The penthouse was completely empty, but the window of opportunity was incredibly narrow. I had Victor drop me 2 blocks away from the luxury high-rise, and I walked toward the building with my head down. I bypassed the main lobby, utilizing the underground service entrance I'd memorized from the original building blueprints. I slipped into the freight elevator and rode it all the way up to the penthouse level, my pulse drumming a steady, rhythmic beat against my ribs. When the heavy metal doors slid open, I stepped into the quiet, carpeted hallway. I stood before the massive oak door of their apartment. Preston once bragged about installing a military-grade smart lock system. To a structural engineer who'd spent decades designing commercial security access, it was just a puzzle waiting to be solved. I knelt, examining the digital keypad and the mechanical deadbolt underneath. I pulled a slim tension wrench and a bypass probe from my pocket. I slipped the probe into the tiny maintenance gap beneath the housing, feeling for the magnetic release. With a slow, deliberate twist of my wrist, I cut the current for just long enough to disengage the deadbolt. The heavy door let out a soft, yielding sigh and clicked open. I stepped inside and pulled the door shut behind me without a sound. The apartment smelled of expensive vanilla candles and impending doom. I didn't waste a second looking at the wedding gifts piled in the living room. I moved with silent, singular purpose toward the master suite, searching for the room Preston claimed was his private home office. I turned the handle and pushed the door open. The space was meticulously organized, projecting the false image of an ultra-successful executive. I began my systematic search. I checked drawers, file cabinets, and the false bottoms of desks, finding nothing. Preston was a convicted con man. He would never leave his most dangerous secrets in a standard drawer. He needed a secure, hidden anchor. I stepped back, evaluating the room with an architect's eye. I calculated the square footage, comparing the interior dimensions of the office to the hallway outside. There was a discrepancy. The wall behind his mahogany desk was nearly 8 inches thicker than building standards allowed. I moved behind the desk, my hands feeling along the smooth plaster. I tapped the surface with my knuckles. About 3 feet from the floor, the sound shifted from a hollow echo to a dull, dense thud. I felt along the baseboard and found a seam that was almost invisible. I pressed hard against the edge of the panel with my fingers, and a small section of the wall popped open on hidden spring hinges. Behind the panel sat a heavy, fireproof steel safe. It was a mechanical combination dial, not a digital keypad. My breathing grew shallow as I knelt before it. Cracking a mechanical safe requires absolute silence and a profound understanding of friction mechanics. I pressed my ear directly against the cold steel door, closing my eyes to isolate my hearing. I gripped the dial, turning it at a painfully slow speed. I listened for the microscopic metallic clicks of the internal pins falling into place. It was a game of tactile feedback, feeling for the slight resistance as the locking mechanism engaged the pins. The first number hit with a heavy click. I reversed, feeling the exact moment the second pin caught. I turned the dial to the right for the final time. The third click echoed loudly in my ears. I pulled down on the heavy handle, and the steel door swung open, revealing the dark interior. I reached into the safe and pulled out a small, black plastic tray. Sitting in the center of the tray was a cheap, burner backup phone, but it was what sat right next to the phone that froze my blood completely. It was a standard amber prescription bottle, stripped of any pharmacy labels. In their place, a piece of white masking tape was wrapped around the plastic. The label was marked simply, Maya's Supplements. I twisted the childproof cap off with shaking fingers. Inside the bottle was a batch of heavy, unmarked blue capsules. These weren't vitamins. These were the chemical chains shackling my daughter to her own end. I quickly tilted the bottle, stealing exactly 2 blue pills, and shoved them deep into my breast pocket for toxicology testing. I tightened the cap and placed the bottle back exactly where it had been. A sharp chime shattered the absolute silence of the apartment. The private elevator signaled on the top floor. Panic burned hot in my chest. They were back early. I jammed the plastic tray back into the safe, slammed the heavy steel door shut, and kicked the hidden wall panel back into place. I struggled to stand, my heart hammering against my sternum. I could hear the front door unlocking. I heard Preston's smooth voice echoing in the foyer. I sprinted out of the office, racing silently down the short hallway, and slipped into the emergency fire stairwell just seconds before Preston turned the corner into the living room. I pulled the heavy fire door shut behind me, leaving a gap of less than half an inch. I stood still as a statue, my back pressed hard against the wall. I could hear Preston moving around the apartment. He walked straight into his office. I heard the unmistakable sound of the hidden wall panel popping open, followed by the rapid spinning of the safe dial. A moment later, I heard the distinct electronic tone of a phone powering on. The burner phone. I pressed my ear against the door crack, straining to catch every syllable. Preston spoke in a lowered, strictly professional tone. I heard him confirm that the cake tasting went well and that Maya was resting. Then, he said the words that confirmed my absolute darkest nightmares. He spoke with chilling, clinical indifference. The dosage is perfect. Her heart rate is dropping. By the time we're in the Alps, it will look exactly like natural altitude sickness. The heavy steel fire door felt like ice against my spine. I held my breath, listening to his heavy footsteps as they moved further away. I waited until I heard the faint rustle of the living room carpet, signaling he'd walked back into the main area of the penthouse. I slipped out of the fire stairwell and took the service elevator down to the underground parking garage. My mind raced with terrifying clarity. I rushed out the exit door and strode toward the rental car where Victor was waiting. I climbed into the passenger seat, pulled the stolen blue capsules from my pocket, and dropped them on the center console. I told Victor exactly what I'd heard through the door crack, without missing a single beat. I repeated Preston's chilling remarks about altitude sickness and the perfect dosage. Victor didn't show even an ounce of surprise. He put the car in gear, wearing a mask of cold focus, and told me we were heading to a private lab he trusted on the north side of the city. Before we made our next move, we needed absolute confirmation. The drive across the city felt like a waking nightmare. Every red light was an agonizing delay, a precious second stolen from my daughter's expiring lifeline. We pulled up to an unassuming concrete building in a quiet business park. The sign on the glass door read, "Advanced Analytical Solutions." Victor bypassed the front desk entirely, leading me down a sterile, brightly lit hallway to the testing facility in the back. He pushed open a swinging door and introduced me to Dr. Aris Thorne, an independent forensic toxicologist who owed Victor a debt. Aris was a quiet man with tired eyes, wearing a clean white lab coat. He didn't ask where the unmarked pills had come from, or why a former investigator was coming through the back door with them. He simply took the capsules, placed them in a sterilization tray, and told us the mass spectrometry analysis would take exactly 3 hours. He directed us to a small, windowless waiting room at the end of the hall. Those 3 hours were the longest of my life. I paced the small room, the rhythmic sound of my boots measuring the agonizing passage of time. I thought of Maya, her pale skin and her hollow eyes. Finally, the heavy door clicked open. Dr. Thorne walked into the room, holding a thick stack of printed analysis reports. His expression was grave, the kind of look a doctor only wears before announcing a terminal diagnosis. He handed the top sheet to Victor, but looked straight at me. He stated that those blue capsules were not nutritional supplements, vitamins, or benign herbal preparations. They were a highly concentrated, lethal cocktail of medication. He explained the chemical makeup with frightening precision. The primary component was a massive dose of a potent prescription beta blocker, designed to artificially suppress a human's heart rate and drive blood pressure down to dangerously low levels. The secondary compound was a powerful, fast-acting hypnotic sedative. Dr. Thorne laid the files on the table, explaining the deadly synergy of the combination. If a healthy person took these pills at sea level, they would experience extreme fatigue, lethargy, and a severe drop in blood pressure. It would mimic a severe viral crash. But if that same person took this precise cocktail while rapidly ascending to high altitudes, like the peaks of the Swiss Alps, the physiological result would be catastrophic. The thin mountain air would force the heart to beat faster to survive, while the beta blockers would forcibly prevent the heart from accelerating. The resulting cardiovascular conflict would cause a massive, instantaneous cardiac arrest. It was a perfectly designed, untraceable method of execution. It would look exactly like a tragic, natural medical collapse caused by severe altitude sickness. The toxicologist's words hit me like a devastating wrecking ball. The room began to spin. A primal fury exploded in my chest, shattering the cold analytical control I'd been holding onto. This was premeditated murder. Preston and Valerie were actively managing my daughter's chemical decline, preparing her body to die alone on a frozen mountain. All of this just to collect a $10 million payout and inherit my life's work. I let out a guttural scream that sounded alien even to my own ears. I grabbed the edge of the metal table, my knuckles turning bone white, and smashed it across the room. It slammed into the drywall with a deafening thud. I turned toward the exit, my vision swimming in a sea of red. I no longer cared about plans, evidence, or authorities. I was going to drive straight back to that penthouse, kick that oak door off its hinges, and tear Preston to pieces with my bare hands. I was going to choke the life out of him. I grabbed the door handle, my muscles coiled with violent intent. Before I could turn it, Victor moved with terrifying speed. He slammed his body against the door, blocking my exit. I grabbed his shirt to throw him aside, but he didn't even blink. He gripped my shoulders, shoved me hard against the wall, and pinned me in place with startling strength. He stared into my furious eyes. His voice was a sharp bark that cut through the noise of my panic. He told me to stop acting like a reckless fool. He stated that if I walked into that penthouse today and killed Preston, I'd rot in prison for the rest of my life. Worse, Valerie would vanish into the shadows, claim those hidden assets, and completely escape legal consequences. Maya would be left alone, traumatized, and entirely vulnerable to the rest of their criminal network. Victor's grip tightened. He lowered his voice, his tone shifting into a cold, razor-sharp promise. He said we had to destroy them legally, systematically, and publicly. We had to trap them in a cage built from their own arrogance and expose their horrific scam in front of everyone they'd manipulated. Only then would Maya truly be safe. I loosened my grip on his shirt. The red fury subsided, replaced by a dark ocean of calculated hatred. I nodded, breathing heavily, and agreed to his terms. I smoothed my jacket, forcing the engineer back to the surface. Victor stepped aside, straightening his collar, satisfied that a crisis had been averted. He opened his laptop. He told me that while the toxicologist was running the analysis, he'd been conducting a deep algorithmic background check on Thomas Vance's history. He'd locked onto outstanding police reports, suspicious accidental deaths, and massive life insurance payouts linked to these aliases over the last 10 years. He said the Boston marriage certificate was just the beginning. He had uncovered a chilling, systematic pattern of lethal predation. Victor turned the laptop so the screen faced me. He pulled up a scanned newspaper clipping from a Florida publication, dated exactly 2 years ago. The headline announced the sudden death of a wealthy heiress during a private yacht trip. He laid his hand flat on the table, pointing a finger directly at the rough photo of the grief-stricken widower in the article. I leaned closer to the glowing screen, the harsh blue light reflecting off the glossy surface of Victor's monitor, casting long, haunting shadows inside our rental car. The bold black letters of the headline screamed at me from the digital archive, branding a permanent mark on my retinas. It read, "Wealthy heiress drowns during Miami honeymoon. Husband survives tragic accident." I stared at the rough black and white photo directly below the text. The man in the photo stood on a wooden dock, burying his face in his hands, performing a perfect, highly dramatic act of extreme grief for the news cameras. He was younger then, his hair slightly different, but the sharp, chiseled angles of his jaw and the cold, predatory posture of his shoulders were unmistakable. It was Preston, or rather, it was Thomas Vance, perfecting his deadly craft 2 years before he ever met my daughter. Victor began reading the details of the police report aloud, his voice flat, clinical, and stripped of any emotion. The victim was a 32-year-old woman who had recently inherited a massive trust fund from her late father. They had been married for less than a month. During a private yacht charter off the Florida coast, she allegedly slipped on a wet deck and went overboard during the night in rough, unpredictable waters. By the time the Coast Guard arrived on the scene for a massive search and rescue operation, it was already too late. An autopsy found traces of potent prescription sedatives in her system, but her new husband smoothly explained to investigators that she had been suffering from severe anxiety and insomnia leading up to the wedding. Local authorities eventually ruled it a tragic accidental drowning. Preston walked away as a heartbroken widower, completely cleared of any criminal suspicion. He also walked away with a clean, undisputed $5 million life insurance payout, which had been wired directly into his private account. The sheer horror of his past washed over me like a tide, but the blinding red fury that had nearly consumed me in the lab just minutes ago was completely gone. In its place, a cold, absolute clarity took hold of my mind. I wasn't dealing with a greedy con man looking for a quick, effortless payday anymore. I was facing an extremely experienced, calculated, and methodical serial killer. He had done this before, he had gotten away with it perfectly, and he was actively refining his deadly process to ensure he was never caught. Maya was just his next target, a much larger financial payout that required a slightly more sophisticated method of execution, the cold, high altitudes of the Swiss Alps instead of the warm waters of Miami. But a serial killer, no matter how smooth, charming, or experienced he appears on the surface, is fundamentally arrogant. Preston thought he was the smartest person in the room. He believed he had secured his ultimate victory. He looked at me and saw a sad, outdated old man whom he could easily sweep aside without a second thought. He didn't realize he had just declared war on a master builder. When an engineer discovers a fatal structural flaw in a massive project, he doesn't panic. He analyzes the complex blueprints, calculates the exact mathematical load required, and builds a permanent, unbreakable solution that eliminates the threat entirely. My daughter's life was the ultimate structure, and I was going to reinforce her fragile foundation with a cage made of undeniable, devastating evidence. I would construct a trap meticulously planned in every detail, airtight from every conceivable angle, so that Preston would never see the sun again. I told Victor to print every page of the Florida police report and pack it carefully with the toxicologist's lethal chemical analysis. I grabbed my phone and immediately dialed the private number of Richard Lawson. Richard was my trusted personal property attorney of over 25 years. He was a brilliant, razor-sharp legal talent who had skillfully helped me navigate complex zoning laws and massive corporate acquisitions to build my entire commercial real estate empire. I told him this was an absolute matter of life and death, and I demanded that he meet me immediately at my private office in downtown Dallas. The long, painful flight back to Texas was a blur of cold, calculated strategy. As the morning sun just began to rise over the sprawling city skyline, I walked into Richard's beautiful, mahogany-paneled office. I didn't waste a second on empty pleasantries or irrelevant small talk. I threw the heavy manila folder Victor had prepared directly into the center of his polished desk. But before Richard could even glance at the criminal background checks or the horrific, lethal chemical reports, I pulled a separate, pristine document from the inner pocket of my suit jacket. It was that terrifying medical power of attorney Preston had practically shoved into my face during our intense, emotional penthouse confrontation. I told Richard that Preston had vehemently claimed the document was just standard procedure to protect Maya's personal assets and ensure health care in the event of routine emergencies. I demanded that Richard read every line, every hidden clause, and every ambiguous footnote in that complex legal jargon. Richard adjusted his glasses and began to scan the document in earnest. The spacious room was absolutely silent, save for the faint hum of the AC unit and the crisp rustle of the heavy legal paper. I watched his eyes move left and right across the dense pages. At first, his expression was completely neutral, analyzing the text with his usual professional detachment. But when he reached page 3, there was a sudden, dramatic shift. The color began to drain rapidly from his cheeks. His jaw dropped slightly, and a sheen of cold sweat broke out on his forehead. He read the final paragraph again, trailing his index finger across the tiny print as if he couldn't believe the words printed before him. He removed his glasses with a violently shaking hand and laid the document slowly back onto the smooth, leather surface of the desk. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with genuine, unconcealed terror. His voice trembled when he finally broke the heavy silence of the office. He told me this wasn't a standard, protective medical proxy. It was an irrevocable, ironclad death warrant wrapped in highly deceptive legalese. Richard leaned forward, gripping the edge of the desk, and spoke the devastating truth. He said, "Harrison, if you allow Maya to sign this, Preston will be granted absolute, undisputed medical authority over her life. If she has a heart attack on that mountain and ends up in a coma, he has the sole legal right to pull the plug immediately. This document explicitly strips you of all parental rights to intervene. You will have absolutely no say, and he will legally murder her while the doctors are forced to stand by and watch." The mahogany-paneled office was dead silent. I stared at that terrifying sheet of paper on the desk, feeling a strange, paradoxical sense of calm wash over my entire body. A weak man would have ripped that document to shreds. A terrified father would have called the police immediately to stop the wedding by force. But I was an engineer. When you discover a structural vulnerability in an enemy stronghold, you don't seal off the tunnel. You plant explosives inside and wait for them to walk in themselves. I looked straight into Richard's pale, panicked eyes and told him we would not stop that medical power of attorney. Richard instinctively recoiled, reminding me that signing that paper was the same as signing my daughter's death warrant. I raised a hand to quiet his mounting panic. I explained that Preston was a meticulous, calculating predator who anticipated resistance. If I suddenly blocked his meticulously drafted legal trap, he would realize his cover was blown instantly. He would abort the mission, drain every account he currently had access to, and vanish into the shadows before we could organize a proper counterstrike. I needed him to believe he had won. I needed him to feel the intoxicating rush of absolute victory. I instructed Richard to draft a secondary, highly complex legal maneuver, a poison pill clause, buried deep within a completely separate trust fund document that Preston would also be required to sign at the rehearsal dinner. This invisible clause would not only render the medical power of attorney null and void the instant his pen left the paper, but it would also trigger an immediate, total asset freeze on all associated accounts in his name. Richard's breathing leveled out, his brilliant legal mind grasping the absolutely devastating elegance of the trap. He nodded slowly, a grim, determined smile creeping across his face. He promised that it would be absolutely impossible for anyone to detect, other than an experienced trust attorney. I left Richard frantically typing at his desk and drove straight to the heavily guarded federal building downtown. I didn't intend to walk into the public lobby and file a generic complaint with some low-level desk agent. I bypassed the standard security protocols, using a private phone number I had kept for 15 years. I called Marcus Thorne, the local field supervisor for the FBI. 20 years ago, Marcus was a brilliant, driven young agent whose career was nearly destroyed by a corrupt bureaucratic technicality. I had used my considerable political leverage and deep financial resources to ensure he was treated fairly, funding a massive legal defense in the shadows that ultimately saved his career and propelled him to his current position of immense power. Marcus owed me a life debt, and today I was finally going to call it in. Within 20 minutes, I was sitting in his secure, soundproofed office. Marcus gave me a warm, sincere hug, but the moment he saw the cold, dead look on my face, his smile vanished. I opened the heavy briefcase and laid the nightmare out on his desk. I showed him the toxicologist's certified report, detailing the lethal chemical cocktail of beta blockers and heavy sedatives Preston was currently feeding my daughter. I presented Victor's comprehensive algorithmic background check, exposing the completely fabricated family estate in Boston and revealing Thomas Vance's true identity as a convicted felon. Finally, I slid the rough black-and-white newspaper clipping from Florida across the smooth desk. Marcus read the horrific details of the accidental drowning of the ex-wife, his experienced eyes connecting the dark, sinister threads in the serial killer's modus operandi. The atmosphere in the safe house grew incredibly heavy. Marcus leaned back in his chair, rubbing his face with his hands. He told me this was a textbook, highly sophisticated predatory operation. He confirmed that Preston was running a perfectly executed, long-term con, exploiting jurisdictional loopholes between state and international law to avoid detection. Marcus explained the harsh, unforgiving reality of the federal justice system. Despite the mountain of circumstantial evidence Victor and I had collected in Boston, it was incredibly difficult to charge a man with attempted murder before the actual crime occurred. The Florida case had already been closed as an accident, and the toxicological evidence from the stolen pills could very easily be explained away by a clever defense attorney as a medication mix-up. Marcus looked at me with a stern, unwavering intensity. He stated that to keep Preston in a federal prison for the rest of his life, they needed to catch him in the act of committing a massive, irrefutable felony. The FBI agreed to authorize a full-scale undercover sting operation, but they needed an absolute, airtight trigger. Marcus explained that wire fraud and federal identity theft carried massive mandatory minimum sentences. If Preston knowingly used his fabricated alias to sign those fraudulent trust documents with the full intention of extorting millions from a federally insured financial institution, the FBI could immediately storm the activity. The plan was terrifyingly simple, yet incredibly dangerous. The rehearsal dinner would be the center of the sting. Federal agents would infiltrate the country club, disguised as servers, valets, and AV technicians. The entire private dining room would be filled with hidden high-definition cameras and directional microphones. But the entire operation depended entirely on a single, fragile point of failure. Preston had to pick up the pen and sign his fake name on the dotted line. At the exact moment he committed the fraud, he had to feel completely safe, absolutely confident, and totally victorious. If he sensed even a tenth of a millimeter of danger, if he spotted a microscopic flaw in the environment, he would refuse to sign, and the entire federal trap would collapse in an instant. The immense weight of the situation landed on my shoulders like a suffocating lead blanket. I left the massive federal building and drove slowly toward my large, empty house. The sun began to sink below the Texas horizon, casting long, bloody streaks of orange and violent red across the vast evening sky. The rehearsal dinner was scheduled to begin in less than 4 hours. I walked into the quiet master bathroom and splashed freezing cold water onto my incredibly exhausted face. I stared at myself in the mirror, watching the droplets trace the deep wrinkles around my eyes. I had to walk into an elegant, crowded restaurant and have dinner with the monster who was planning to murder my only child. I had to clink glasses with him, deliver a touching speech, and look straight into the cold, dead eyes of a serial killer, without showing even a flicker of the blind, volcanic fury boiling in my chest. If my smile wavered for even a second, if my hands shook, or if there was even a drop of venom in my voice, Preston would be spooked instantly and run. I straightened my silk tie, buried the terrified father deep inside, and awakened the cold, calculating engineer. I turned away from the mirror and walked out the door. The drive from my quiet estate to the ballroom of the five-star hotel in downtown Dallas took exactly 45 minutes. I used every second of that commute to bury the fury of a father beneath a thick, impenetrable veneer of resignation. I handed my keys to the valet, making a conscious effort to let my shoulders slump and my gait appear heavy and labored. I pushed through the towering glass doors into the opulently decorated foyer. This rehearsal dinner was a massive display of artificial wealth, all of it funded by my own accounts. 150 of the most elite, influential citizens in the city were gathered in that room. There were prominent real estate developers, local politicians, and wealthy socialites, all dressed in their finest evening wear. They sipped expensive champagne, exchanging pleasantries, completely unaware that they were merely background extras in this carefully curated theater of deception. I stopped at the arched entrance of the ballroom and took a breath to steady my racing heart. I let my face slacken completely, wearing a mask of utter emotional exhaustion. I was no longer the sharp, commanding engineer who built skyscrapers. I was just a tired, defeated old man who had finally surrendered his entire legacy to the passage of time. I moved slowly through the sea of impeccably dressed guests, offering weak, polite smiles to my colleagues and business associates. The soft hum of classical music and polite conversation filled the cavernous room. Before I could even reach the private head table, a smooth, all too familiar voice cut through the noise. Preston emerged from the crowd, wearing a tuxedo that fit his athletic frame perfectly. He stepped directly into my path, a broad, magnanimous smile plastered across his handsome face, the radiant, chilling smile of a predator convinced he had already devoured his prey. He reached out and seized my hand in a firm, completely dominant grip, his other hand raising to give my shoulder a forceful pat. He thanked me loudly for coming, projecting the image of a generous, forgiving son-in-law for the benefit of the guests nearby. He leaned in, his breath hitting my ear as he whispered that he was glad I'd decided to be reasonable. He smelled of expensive cologne and pure, unadulterated arrogance. I swallowed my disgust, forcing my eyes to drop in a show of complete submission. I told him quietly that I only wanted my daughter to be happy. As Preston released my hand, Valerie glided over, her movements fluid and practiced. She wore a stunning deep-red evening gown that commanded the attention of half the room. She held two crystal flutes filled with bubbling champagne. Her dark eyes locked onto mine, flickering with a nearly uncontrollable, greedy hunger. She extended a manicured hand, offering me a glass with a perfectly rehearsed expression of family warmth. She told me, in a voice dripping with artificial sweetness, how thrilled they were to merge our families tonight. I took the delicate flute, my fingers brushing hers. I knew the horrific truth about the woman standing before me. She wasn't a supportive sister welcoming me into her circle. She was the cold, calculating wife of a convicted felon, a willing accomplice to serial murder, eagerly awaiting her massive financial payout. I gave a stiff nod, thanking her for her supposed kindness, then brought the glass to my lips without letting a single drop pass my teeth. I carefully placed the untouched champagne on the tray of a passing server. I pulled my focus away from that terrifying couple and looked to the center of the grand head table. My heart shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. Maya sat silently in a high-backed velvet chair, appearing completely isolated amidst the raucous celebration. The damage that lethal cocktail of drugs was inflicting on her body was absolutely devastating. My beautiful, vibrant daughter looked like a frail ghost of her former self. Her usually bright, expressive eyes were now sunken and dull, surrounded by deep, bruised-looking shadows. Her skin had taken on a horrific, translucent pallor, completely devoid of any healthy color. She was visibly trembling, her thin hands gripping the edge of the heavy table just to keep herself upright in her chair. She looked profoundly exhausted, lost in a suffocating chemical fog that prevented her from realizing the imminent danger surrounding her. I wanted to rush forward, pull her from that table, and carry her out of that building, but my peripheral vision caught an incredibly subtle, fleeting movement. A tall man dressed as a catering captain adjusted his earpiece. Near the back wall, a technician managing the ambient lighting moved a hidden camera lens. Marcus and his federal agents were in place, completely invisible to the untrained eye. The trap was set and waiting. I had to hold my ground. I walked to the head table and took my assigned seat beside my daughter. Maya turned her head slowly, her movements sluggish and incredibly uncoordinated. She gave me a faint, trembling smile, whispering that she was glad I was there. I gave her cold, clammy hand a gentle squeeze, promising her silently that the nightmare was about to end. The lavish multi-course dinner began, a parade of exquisite culinary creations that tasted like ash in my mouth. The elite guests laughed and drank, completely unaware of the deadly stakes playing out at the front of the room. Preston commanded the table, charming everyone with his fabricated stories of generational wealth and corporate success. He played the role of the devoted partner to perfection, occasionally leaning over to kiss Maya's pale cheek or whisper false reassurances in her ear. Every affectionate gesture he made was a carefully calculated move to cement his perfect alibi. I sat quietly, eating nothing, my eyes fixed on the white tablecloth. With absolute, unwavering discipline, I played the part of the heartbroken, isolated father. I let the time tick by, with the cold, patient resolve of a sniper waiting for the designated target to walk into the crosshairs. As the undercover federal agents cleared the final dessert plates, the ambient noise in the ballroom began to die down naturally. Preston rose gracefully from his chair, a fresh glass of champagne held high in his right hand. He tapped his silver spoon against the crystal rim. The sharp, clear chime grabbed the room instantly. 150 influential guests went completely silent, turning their expectant faces toward the head table. Preston smiled warmly, his charismatic gaze sweeping across the gathered crowd before settling entirely on me. He spoke in a booming, dramatic voice that echoed off the high ceilings. He announced that before the dancing began, his wonderful father-in-law had a special, profoundly meaningful gift to present formally to the couple. He announced that this was the official signing of the family trust. Preston reached into his impeccably tailored jacket and pulled out a thick, leather-bound folder. He slid that lethal medical power of attorney and a heavy gold pen along the polished wood tabletop, pushing it directly to my side. The entire room watched in absolute silence. The heavy gold pen felt cold and foreign against the callous skin of my aging fingers. I picked it up slowly, turning it in my hand as if assessing the absolute weight of the metal. The room remained suspended in a suffocating, expectant hush. 150 influential pairs of eyes were fixed entirely on me, waiting for this defeated patriarch to officially sign away his empire and retreat into the shadows. I looked up from the leather folder and shifted my gaze toward my daughter. Maya was slumping sideways in her velvet chair, her eyelids fluttering heavily as she fought a losing battle against the high-dosage, invisible chemical sedative coursing through her blood. She had no idea that the document before me was a legally binding death warrant designed to orchestrate a murder on a frozen European mountain. I shifted my gaze from her pale, fragile face and looked straight at Preston. He was leaning over the white tablecloth, his flawless posture revealing a raw, predatory hunger. He was practically salivating, his dark eyes tracking the gold pen in my hand with an intense, intoxicating greed. He believed he had calculated every variable, anticipated my emotional submission, and leveraged my parental love to secure his $10 million payout. Valerie sat beside him, mirroring his barely concealed anticipation, her fingers gripping the stem of her champagne flute. They were waiting for that final, decisive stroke of ink that would cement their ultimate victory. I let the silence stretch for an agonizing second, maintaining eye contact with them with a completely blank expression. I wasn't in a hurry. I allowed the heavy, suffocating pressure in the room to build until it felt almost touchable. I slowly pushed my chair back, the wooden leg scraping a harsh, grating sound against the polished marble floor. I stood up straight, squared my shoulders, and shed the illusion of the tired, broken old man I had meticulously crafted. I reached across the table and pulled the delicate, silver fluorocore microphone close to my lips. I knew Marcus and his entire team of undercover federal agents were listening through their hidden earpieces, waiting for the exact audio trigger to initiate the sting. I tapped the microphone twice. The sharp, rhythmic thud, like a gavel striking a sounding board, carried across the massive ballroom. The elite guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing a sudden, inexplicable shift in atmospheric pressure. I looked at the crowd, then shifted my gaze back to Preston, locking onto his eyes with the cold, unyielding precision of an architect analyzing a critical structural failure. I spoke in a low, resonant voice that reached the farthest corners of the room with ease. 40 years ago, I built my first skyscraper. I paused, letting the profound weight of that sentence settle over the silent audience. I explained that the fundamental rules of commercial engineering were incredibly simple. You could use the most expensive materials on Earth. You could hire the smartest designers, and you could polish the exterior glass until it sparkled like diamonds in the sun. But if the foundation concrete was poured on unstable soil, then the entire building was fundamentally doomed to destruction. I kept my eyes fixed entirely on Preston as I continued. A structure built on lies will always collapse under the immense weight of its own deception. Preston's meticulously maintained demeanor shifted subtly and dangerously. His smug, triumphant smile faltered, replaced by a stiff, barely perceptible tightening of his jawline. He recognized the sudden shift in my tone. For a man who had spent his entire adult life building elaborate illusions to trap vulnerable women, there was absolutely no way he could miss the underlying threat hidden in my architectural metaphor. He flicked a quick glance toward the emergency exit doors. His survival instinct finally began to whisper warnings in his ear. I refused to break eye contact, increasing the pressure in my voice, letting the sheer, volcanic fury I had kept suppressed finally bleed into my carefully chosen words. I told the captivated room that a family was exactly like a massive steel structure. It required unshakable honesty, absolute transparency, and a foundation forged in genuine love to survive the violent storms of life. When parasites infiltrated that structure, when they systematically chiseled away at load-bearing walls and replaced solid steel with toxic manipulation, that building became a deadly danger to everyone living inside it. I held the gold pen up midair, displaying it before the silent crowd like a piece of irrefutable criminal evidence. I stated that the document on the table was absolutely not a standard trust agreement designed to protect my daughter. I announced that this was a highly sophisticated, meticulously engineered trap, drafted by someone who had honed the art of predatory destruction to perfection long before they ever set foot in Texas. A low, collective hum of extreme confusion rippled across the ballroom. The wealthy guests exchanged glances of disbelieving bewilderment, completely unsure if this was some bizarre, heavily scripted part of the rehearsal entertainment, or a catastrophic public mental breakdown. Valerie completely lost her composure. She rose suddenly from her chair, her deep red gown making a loud, friction-filled sound against the fabric, her face a mask of rage and indignation. She tried desperately to interrupt me, raising her voice, loudly suggesting that the emotional stress of the upcoming wedding had clearly caused me to suffer a severe mental collapse. She reached across the table, frantically trying to snatch the leather folder from my hand. I slammed my left hand down onto the document, pinning it to the table with a force so violent and booming that it shook the crystal glasses, silencing her frantic protests instantly. I stared straight at Valerie, stripping away the final remnants of my polite, socially acceptable mask. I told her to sit down and remain absolutely silent, or she would come to deeply regret her actions. She froze, her eyes widening in sudden terror as she recognized the raw, unadulterated threat radiating from my posture. I shifted my attention back to Preston. His face had completely drained of color. He was slowly pushing his chair back, preparing to bolt for the nearest emergency exit. He knew the game was thoroughly over. He had walked straight into the trap, and the jaws of steel were closing rapidly around his throat. I held the gold pen, hovering over the signature line of that lethal medical power of attorney. The entire room collectively held its breath, waiting for the final, decisive action. I looked at the man who had actively plotted to murder my only child on a frozen European mountain for a $10 million payout. I smiled, letting the predatory wolf finally show its teeth. I dropped that heavy gold pen. It clattered against the polished wood and rolled away from the fraudulent document. I reached deep into my suit jacket pocket and pulled out my phone. I didn't say another word. I stared into Preston's terrified eyes and intentionally pressed a button on the glowing screen. Instantly, every light in the grand ballroom cut to complete black. The sudden darkness plunged the magnificent ballroom into a state of absolute sensory deprivation. For less than a second, the only sound in the massive space was the collective gasp of the city's 150 elite guests. The sudden absence of the brilliant chandeliers left a heavy, suffocating weight above the white tablecloths. I stood motionless in the pitch black, my eyes quickly adjusting to the absence of light. I could hear the faint, nervous rustling of silk evening gowns and the restless scuffing of leather shoes on the marble floor. Beside me, I heard Preston let out a short, dismissive breath, an arrogant sneer in the darkness. He muttered something about a blown fuse or a technical glitch from the hotel catering staff. He still believed he was in complete control of the narrative. He still thought this was nothing more than an inconvenient interlude in his journey of perfect victory. He had absolutely no idea that I had already detonated the explosives beneath the very foundation he had meticulously built. Then a low, mechanical hum began to vibrate from high above the ceiling at the far end of the room. It was the heavy, rhythmic whirring of the massive digital projector installed in the ceiling powering up. A beam of blinding, high-definition pure white light sliced through the darkness, traveling directly over the heads of the bewildered guests to strike the massive canvas screen mounted directly behind the head table. The sudden illumination cast long, twisted silhouettes against the walls. The crowd stirred in expectation, shifting in their seats, anticipating a romantic montage belonging to the happy couple. They expected a slideshow of cherry-picked, smiling vacations, sunset dinners, and manufactured memories. Instead, the first image that flashed onto the massive screen was a high-resolution scan of a legal document, magnified so large that the crisp black text was clearly legible even from the very back of the dining room. The brilliant light swept across the upturned faces of the audience, illuminating their polite, curious expressions. The collective realization took exactly 3 seconds. The document projected behind us was the marriage certificate from Clark County, Nevada. The names Thomas Vance and Valerie Vance were printed in bold, undeniable letters directly above their legal signatures, accompanied by an official government seal and a filing date from 8 years ago. A sharp, unified gasp erupted from the center of the room. It rolled through the crowd like a shockwave, the physical manifestation of their sudden, horrified understanding of the truth. The influential politicians, wealthy developers, and high society patrons sat frozen, their champagne flutes forgotten in midair. The illusion of the supportive, loving sister was shattered instantly, broadcast to the entire city in 10-foot-high letters. I turned slowly to look at Valerie. The light from the projector painted a harsh, unflattering halo of illumination over her face. She was staring at the screen with her mouth agape, the color draining rapidly from her cheeks until her skin was as chalky as parchment. She looked like a trapped animal, paralyzed by the sudden, intrusive spotlight. Preston jumped from his chair, knocking it over onto the floor behind him. He began frantically waving his arms, shouting into the darkness for someone to cut the power, claiming this was a malicious prank or a horrific forgery. But his smooth, charming voice was now laced with a sharp, unmistakable tremor of pure, unadulterated panic. The mask was sliding off, cracking under the massive pressure of public exposure. I ignored his frantic shouting and kept my hand casually in my pocket. I pressed a small button on my phone for the second time. The projector clicked loudly, advancing the presentation to the next slide. The marriage certificate vanished instantly, replaced by a split-screen display. On the left was the rough newspaper clipping from Florida, detailing the tragic drowning of a wealthy heiress during her honeymoon. On the right was the official forensic autopsy report, clearly marking the presence of heavy sedatives in the victim's bloodstream. The headline announcing the survival of the grieving husband was magnified, with an arrow pointing directly from the name Thomas Vance in the police report to an undeniable, high-definition photograph. A photograph of Preston standing on that dock in Miami 2 years ago. The murmurs in the ballroom escalated into loud, frantic whispers. The guests were no longer merely confused. They were terrified. They looked at a man they had just dined with, realizing they were breaking bread with a predator. The air in the room turned cold, filled with the undeniable reality of premeditated murder. I watched the prominent real estate developers lean away from the head table, physically distancing themselves from the monster standing in the center of the room. Preston spun in place, his hands desperately clutching at his own hair, screaming for the hotel management to kill the projector. He was thoroughly undone. His perfect, unshakable facade was completely dismantled by the irrefutable truth shining brightly behind him. I pressed the button on my phone for the third and final time. The screen flickered, delivering the fatal, devastating blow. The image switched to Dr. Aris Thorne's certified toxicology report. The harsh, clinical text detailed the exact chemical breakdown of the lethal cocktail of beta blockers and hypnotic sedatives. Placed directly beside the lab results was an incredibly clear photograph of the blue capsules contained in the amber prescription bottle marked Maya's supplements. The text on the screen explained clearly how this chemical cocktail was specifically designed to induce massive cardiac arrest at high altitudes, effectively mimicking a tragic, natural death in the mountains. The ballroom erupted into absolute, uncontrolled chaos. The guests scrambled to their feet, pushing their chairs aside. The cries of horror and disbelief echoed off the high ceilings. Women covered their mouths, and men shouted for someone to call the police. The elegant, sophisticated rehearsal dinner had transformed, in an instant, into a terrifying theater of criminal exposure. The most profound reaction, however, did not come from the wealthy audience. It came from the empty chair beside me. The sudden scream, the blinding light of the projector, and the chaotic energy vibrating through the room finally pierced the heavy, suffocating chemical fog that had been shrouding my daughter's mind. A massive surge of pure adrenaline cut through the heavy sedative. Maya's head snapped up. Her breathing became rapid and shallow. She braced her hands against the polished wood of the table, her knuckles turning bone white as she forced herself to sit perfectly upright. She turned her head slowly, her sunken, exhausted eyes tracking the massive letters on the bright screen. She read the toxicologist's report. The devastating reality smashed into her, shattering the beautiful, artificial hallucination of her perfect romance. She shifted her gaze from the screen and looked straight at the man she had planned to marry. Preston stood frozen by the head table. He looked at my daughter, her eyes wide with absolute horror. He realized he had walked blindfolded into a slaughterhouse. There was absolutely nowhere left to hide. The absolute silence in the grand ballroom lasted for less than a second, before the sickening reality of the projected images shattered the elegant atmosphere. Valerie was the first to react to the blinding exposure. The delicate illusion of the gentle, caring sister evaporated in an instant, completely replaced by the primal, panicked instinct of a cornered animal. She kicked her velvet chair backward, the heavy wood grinding violently against the polished marble floor, and she bolted toward the swinging wooden doors of the catering kitchen. She moved with a sudden, reckless speed. Her expensive high heels slipped on the slick stone, causing the heavy silk of her deep-red evening gown to tear slightly. She clearly thought she'd spotted a fleeting opening, a narrow, unguarded escape route into the dark service corridors that would lead her safely to the underground parking garage. But she severely underestimated the ironclad perimeter I had quietly built around the room. Just as her hands desperately slammed into those swinging doors, a massive, unyielding dark shadow stepped directly into her path. It was Victor. He didn't offer a single verbal warning, nor did he attempt to read her any rights. He simply reached out a massive, calloused hand, caught the heavy fabric of her expensive dress exactly at the shoulder, and spun her around with a terrifying, unstoppable momentum. He slammed her back hard against the solid structural wall with a heavy, sickening thud. The air in her lungs was squeezed out in a sharp, painful gasp. Victor pinned her firmly there, his face a mask of impenetrable, cold, professional fury, effectively halting her frantic escape before she even made it out of the chaotic dining room. The elite guests around them screamed, scrambling away in blind panic. I didn't waste even a single glance on Valerie. My focus was locked entirely on Preston. The devastating, undeniable realization of this absolute failure triggered a terrifying physical transformation. His handsome, charming facade practically melted before my eyes, revealing the psychopathic, cold-blooded killer hidden beneath the expensive tuxedo. His jaw clenched so tightly that I could almost hear the violent grinding of his teeth over the rising screams of the crowd. The smooth, calculating suitor who had so easily charmed his way into my daughter's vulnerable life was gone, replaced by a cornered predator who suddenly realized the steel trap had closed irrevocably around his throat. He looked wildly at the massive projection screen displaying his past crimes, then down at the useless gold pen resting on the white tablecloth. Federal agents disguised as catering servers and lighting technicians were slowly tightening the circle, moving with purpose through the panicked, scattering crowd, their hands hovering dangerously near hidden weapons. Preston knew he was completely surrounded, but his pathologically extreme arrogance refused to let him surrender quietly. A wild, guttural scream tore from his throat, a sound of sheer horror, completely devoid of any human empathy or rational thought. He slammed his large hands down onto the white tablecloth, lunging directly over the head table, sweeping heavy silverware, crystal champagne flutes, and delicate floral arrangements crashing to the floor. He lunged straight for me, his fingers curled into tight, lethal fists, aiming to tear me apart in one final, desperate act of violent retribution. He fully expected me to flinch in fear, to recoil in terror like the defeated, heartbroken old man I had professionally masqueraded as all evening. I did not flinch. I did not step back, and I absolutely did not raise my hands in a defensive posture. Throughout the agonizing evening, I had been leaning heavily on a thick, solid oak cane to physically sell the deceptive facade of my rapidly declining health and extreme physical weakness. Preston had completely dismissed this heavy cane as a sad, necessary prop for my aging frailty. He had made a fundamentally fatal mistake. This was a perfectly weighted, high-density structural weapon. As he rapidly closed the extremely short distance between us, his handsome face twisted with the fury of blind murder, I smoothly shifted my body weight, standing firm with the stable, grounded balance of an experienced master builder. I gripped the polished brass handle of the heavy-duty cane with both hands, pivoted my hips, and swung the solid oak rod with every ounce of pure physical force I possessed. I didn't aim for his head or his broad chest. I mathematically calculated the precise downward trajectory needed to completely neutralize his forward momentum. The heavy wood slammed directly into the fragile side of his left knee. The sound of the physical impact was absolutely deafening, a sharp, structural snap of bone breaking clearly cut through the screaming of the crowd. Preston's violent forward momentum collapsed instantly. The complex joint shattered completely under the immense, unyielding force of the targeted strike. His furious roar of rage turned immediately into a sharp, piercing shriek of pure physical agony as his leg buckled violently beneath him. He crashed heavily onto the cold marble floor, completely incapacitated, clutching his ruined knee in desperation as undercover federal agents immediately flooded forward from the surrounding shadows. Federal agents quickly surrounded the front of the dining room, their voices issuing roars of absolute authority, instructing the remaining panicked guests to step back and ordering Preston to remain absolutely still on the floor. The blinding, flashing red and blue lights of several local police cruisers suddenly illuminated the high glass windows of the grand ballroom, casting shadows against the beautifully decorated walls. The massive trap had been triggered with flawless mechanical precision. But even as he writhed in agony on the cold stone floor, completely surrounded by heavily armed federal law enforcement, Preston's arrogance refused to die. He looked up at me, his face pale and twisted in pure physical pain, breathing heavily through his clenched teeth. He sneered, attempting a pathetic imitation of his former smug sense of superiority. He sprayed desperate words into the air, trying to regain even a tiny fraction of control over the situation. He shouted at the top of his lungs, claiming I had absolutely nothing on him. He screamed that I was just a crazed, paranoid old man who had just brutally assaulted him in front of over 100 reliable witnesses. He pointed a violently shaking finger at the dark leather folder lying completely untouched on the white tablecloth above. He shouted that he hadn't actually signed anything, and without his handwritten signature on that fraudulent legal document, I could never legally prove his specific intent to commit federal wire fraud. He truly believed he had succeeded in finding the one microscopic legal loophole in the trap I had designed. I lowered my oak cane slowly and walked deliberately toward the edge of the polished table. I leaned down carefully, bringing my mouth within inches of the silver floral microphone. I spoke looking straight down at the broken, pathetic creature bleeding on the floor, speaking with a calm, absolute certainty that squeezed the final breath of air from his lungs. I stared straight into his miserable eyes and said firmly, "Oh, but you did." As my words hung in the cold air, the sharp feedback of the microphone echoed through the massive ballroom. Preston's face twisted into a grotesque hybrid of physical agony and absolute confusion. He clutched his shattered knee, his chest heaving, looking up at me from the cold marble floor. He was desperately trying to process what I had just said, his brain racing to find a logical flaw in my statement. He breathed through gritted teeth, demanding to know what I meant, insisting again that his signature wasn't on any binding contract. I moved around the wreckage of the silverware and crystal champagne flutes scattered across the floor. I looked down at the pathetic predator writhing at my feet and delivered the final, devastating blow to his crumbling foundation. I spoke in the calm, rhythmic tone of a man who had successfully reinforced a load-bearing wall against a Category 5 hurricane. I told him he was completely correct regarding the specific family trust document currently resting on the table. He hadn't signed it, but his narrow, arrogant mind had been completely focused on the wrong trap. I informed him that wire fraud and extortion were never the primary crimes I was truly interested in charging him with. Those were merely secondary mechanisms designed to ensure federal jurisdiction over his inevitable prosecution. I leaned closer to the microphone, ensuring that every guest, every undercover agent, and my terrified daughter could hear the absolute truth. I asked Preston a simple, yet devastatingly destructive question. I asked him if he honestly believed that he had really been poisoning Maya's vitamins for the past 72 hours. The remaining color drained rapidly from his flushed face, turning his skin a dirty, ash gray. His eyes darted quickly toward Maya, who sat motionless in her velvet chair, listening to every word as the dawn-like realization rose with a terrifying sense of clarity. I didn't give Preston even a single second to fabricate a deceptive answer. I raised my voice, filling the massive space with the unyielding authority of a protective father. I revealed that 3 days prior, while they were completely distracted by the fraudulent wedding preparations, I had broken through the defenses of their supposedly impenetrable luxury penthouse. I explained how I had easily bypassed his expensive, military-grade smart lock, avoided his security cameras, and located the hidden steel safe hidden behind false plasterboard in his private home office. I watched as absolute terror finally swallowed the pain in Preston's dark eyes. He suddenly understood the catastrophic scale of his miscalculation. I described in detail how I had carefully cracked the mechanical dial of his fireproof safe and extracted the cheap plastic tray hidden inside. I told him I had found the amber prescription bottle marked with my daughter's name. I explained that I had gone straight to a private, independent toxicologist with the lethal blue capsules to confirm their highly lethal chemical composition. Then I executed the most critical stage of my entire structural counterattack. I looked Preston straight in his terrified eyes and told him I had meticulously replaced every one of his toxic pills containing heavy sedatives with completely harmless, inert placebos. A gasp erupted from the gathered group of high society socialites and prominent politicians. The horrific reality of premeditated murder was now undeniable. I continued my relentless dismantling of his criminal empire. I stated that the actual poison he had painstakingly acquired to orchestrate my daughter's lethal heart attack on the cold, high altitudes of the European Alps was no longer in his possession. I had personally handed the lethal chemical cocktail, along with the burner phone he used to secretly order the deadly substances, directly to the FBI. I explained that federal forensic technicians had extracted his digital fingerprints, his encrypted text messages, and his precise cellular geolocation data from that device. He had unknowingly provided federal authorities with a perfectly recorded, irrefutable confession of his own malicious intent. Maya let out a sharp, trembling breath. The heavy, suffocating fog that had been clouding her mind for weeks was rapidly dissipating, replaced by the pure, terrifying gravity of how close she had come to being executed. She stared at the man she had once loved, the man who had whispered promises of a beautiful future while methodically feeding her lethal doses of chemical poison. Preston tried to push his body backward on the marble floor, dragging his shattered knee behind him, in a pathetic attempt to escape the blinding spotlight of his own exposure. He was completely trapped, like a rat in a meticulously designed steel cage. Before Preston could fabricate one last desperate lie, the heavy double-oak doors at the rear entrance of the grand ballroom burst open. The massive crash echoed like thunder, instantly shattering the remaining tension in the room. A dozen heavily armed federal agents stormed into the elegant dining room. Their dark tactical gear stood in sharp, horrific contrast to the formal evening wear of the panicked guests. The lead agent, Field Supervisor Marcus Thorne, strode down the center aisle with an unshakable, absolute authority. He pointed a majestic finger at the bleeding man on the floor, ordering his agents to secure the primary suspect immediately. Two burly federal agents lunged forward, grabbing Preston's impeccably tailored tuxedo jacket and hauling him up roughly. Preston let out a shriek of pure, unadulterated agony as his shattered knee bore the shifted weight. They slammed his face into the polished mahogany of the head table, forcing his arms behind his back. The sharp, metallic click of heavy-duty steel handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed through the silent room with a sense of absolute finality. Preston struggled wildly in their iron-fisted grip, his former charming composure completely replaced by the frantic, pathetic struggle of a defeated criminal. He screamed desperately, hurling vicious, incoherent threats into the air as his entire fraudulent life was completely and irrevocably dismantled. Meanwhile, a second tactical team assembled in the dark service corridor near the catering kitchen. The heavy swinging doors were pushed open, and Victor forcibly marched Valerie back into the room. Valerie was shoved into the main ballroom. Her beautiful deep-red evening gown was torn, and her perfectly styled hair was completely disheveled. She screamed frantically, fighting against the heavy steel handcuffs locking her wrists, demanding to speak to a lawyer. Federal agents ignored her hysterical protests entirely, flanking her on both sides and forcibly marching her out toward the main exit alongside her fake brother. They were both dragged into the flashing red and blue lights of the police cars waiting outside, their meticulously planned lethal facade permanently terminated. I shifted my entire focus away from the departing criminals and looked down at my daughter. Maya was shaking violently, her pale hands clutching the edge of the white tablecloth. The horrific realization finally broke her as she eventually realized how close she had come to a lonely, tragic death. She let out a hoarse, heartbreaking sob and collapsed into my outstretched arms. I held her tight, completely protecting my beautiful, thoroughly terrified, and deeply relieved only child. The frantic frenzy in the grand ballroom slowly dissolved into a sense of raw, echoing emptiness. The terrified elite guests, once eager participants in a celebration of artificial wealth, had completely dispersed into the cold night sky, leaving behind a grand and devastated scene. Overturned velvet chairs, shattered crystal champagne flutes, and trampled floral arrangements lay scattered across the polished marble floor like casualties of a silent war. The heavy double-oak doors remained wide open, allowing the cool, sobering chill blowing in from the hotel lobby to finally sweep away the lingering scent of expensive cologne and artificial sweetness. A small team of disciplined federal agents remained near the catering kitchen, meticulously placing the fraudulent legal documents into evidence bags and securing the ruined table as formal, irrefutable evidence. The blinding, flashing red and blue lights of the local police cars had faded from the towering glass windows, replaced by the steady, unyielding light of the distant city skyline, proof that beyond that isolated nightmare, the enduring reality remained. I remained seated at the head table, at the epicenter of the shattered illusion, wrapping my suit jacket tightly around my daughter's trembling shoulders. The massive digital projector behind us had turned off, returning the massive canvas screen to a state of absolute, forgiving darkness. Maya rested her heavy head against my chest, and as her exhausted system slowly metabolized the final remaining traces of the lethal sedative, her breathing finally slowed, returning to a steady, natural rhythm. The nightmare had been completely and permanently ended by force. We were left entirely alone in the massive room, surrounded by the physical debris of a perfectly executed con. But the suffocating atmospheric pressure had been completely lifted. Maya moved slightly, her pale hands reaching upward to grasp the fabric of my lapels. She looked up, her beautiful, expressive eyes searching my face with a heartbreaking mixture of profound gratitude and overwhelming guilt. Tears flowed silently down her cheeks, catching the faint ambient light of the foyer. She spoke in a fragile, trembling voice, the words agonizingly caught in her dry throat. She apologized. She repeated the word over and over, burying her face into my chest, weeping for the beautiful lie she had wanted to believe in so desperately. She told me how incredibly sorry she was for pushing me away over the past 6 months, ignoring my valid concerns, and blindly accusing me of being a jealous, paranoid old man who just refused to let her grow up. She confessed that Preston had systemically isolated her, planting subtle, toxic whispers in her mind that I was trying to control her inheritance and ruin her happiness. She sobbed, her small body shaking violently, asking how she could have been so incredibly stupid. How could she have looked a cold-blooded killer in the eyes every day and seen only a loyal, loving partner? I stroked her hair gently and kissed the top of her head with a fierce, unconditional love that transcended any temporary anger or past misunderstandings. I kept my voice low, steady, and infinitely reassuring, anchoring her firmly in the present reality. I told her there was absolutely nothing she needed to apologize for. I explained that predators like Preston and Valerie didn't target victims because they were weak or stupid. They had locked onto someone like her precisely because she possessed a kind, trusting, and immensely beautiful capacity for empathy. They weaponized her best qualities, using her inherent goodness as a blindfold to completely mask their true, malicious intentions from her view. I lifted her chin, forcing her to meet my gaze. I told her that in this world, from the moment I held her in the hospital delivery room, my only job was to be her unyielding shield. I stated that a father didn't stop protecting his child just because the child believed they were perfectly safe. I explained that I would be willing to tear down every skyscraper I had ever built with my own hands, burn my entire fortune to ash, and willingly walk into the line of fire 1,000 times over, just to ensure she was able to take her next breath of air. As I watched true understanding and deep relief settle over her exhausted features, the crushing weight of the past 3 days finally lifted from my shoulders. She wrapped her arms around my neck, holding me with a desperate, immense strength, finally anchoring herself to the one man in her life who had never lied to her. We sat together in that silent, ruined ballroom for another hour, allowing the sheer adrenaline to fully recede from our systems. Eventually, a quiet, respectful federal agent walked to the table, politely informing us that our formal statement had been fully processed and we were officially cleared to return to our private estate. I nodded, thanking him for his absolute professionalism. I stood up slowly, pressing my weight onto my sturdy oak cane, the adrenaline's recession finally reminding me of the severe physical toll my aging joints had paid that night. I extended my free hand to Maya. She gripped it tightly, her grasp steady and surprisingly strong. Together, we walked slowly through the chaotic ruins of the rehearsal dinner, past the shattered remnants of the lethal illusion, and out through the grand archways. We crossed the luxurious hotel foyer, our footsteps echoing softly on the polished marble, leaving the dark, dangerous chapter of our lives permanently behind us. We stepped out through the towering glass doors into the crisp, refreshing night air of downtown Dallas, taking a deep breath and pulling a sense of undeniable, absolute freedom into our lungs. The dark, sinister storm that had threatened to consume our family entirely had finally passed, leaving behind a clear, brilliant sky illuminated by millions of distant stars. The massive generational wealth I had spent a lifetime building was completely secure, thoroughly isolated from the greedy, blood-stained hands of those predatory monsters. The highly complex trust documents and that lethal medical power of attorney had been permanently seized as primary federal evidence, destined to rot in an evidence locker for eternity. Preston and Valerie were currently sitting in cold, isolated federal interrogation rooms, facing a mountain of irrefutable, absolutely lethal physical evidence. Federal prosecutors were already preparing a massive indictment including multiple counts of attempted murder, interstate wire fraud, and grave conspiracy charges. They were facing the absolute certainty of spending the remainder of their miserable lives within the sterile, windowless walls of a maximum security federal prison, without the slightest possibility of parole. Their names would be completely wiped from our history, relegated to a brief, horrifying cautionary tale. As the valet pulled my car up to the grand entrance, I looked at my daughter. This brutal, relentless ordeal had stripped away her innocence, but it hadn't shattered her spirit. A profound bond between a father and daughter, tested by the most absolute, malicious evil imaginable, had been forged in the fire into unbreakable, pure steel. We climbed into the quiet safety of the waiting car, fully prepared to go home and safely begin the rest of our lives. A full year has passed since that exceptionally dark, chaotic night in downtown Dallas, and a calm, comforting peace has finally returned to our quiet estate. The federal trial was exceptionally rapid, like a high-functioning, unstoppable machine of absolute justice. Faced with the mountain of overwhelming physical evidence, the independent lab-certified toxicological reports, the recovered burner phone, and the newly excavated, irrefutable connections to the tragic Florida murder case, Preston and Valerie completely abandoned their arrogant facade. To avoid the threat of the looming death penalty, both of them quickly accepted desperate plea deals. They are now quietly rotting within the sterile, windowless walls of a maximum security federal prison, spending the remaining, unyielding years of their natural adult lives. 6 months ago, they filed a pathetic, desperate legal appeal, loudly claiming that I had maliciously framed them and completely fabricated the digital evidence. But the federal judge literally laughed them out of the courtroom, kicking them out of that harsh, silent hall of justice. Maya moved back into our expansive family home, spending a few exceptionally quiet, intensely healing months. It was a slow, delicate process of profound physical and emotional recovery. I watched the heavy, toxic brain fog gradually dissipate from her beautiful mind. Vibrant, healthy color finally returned to her pale cheeks, completely replacing that horrific, translucent pallor that had haunted my nightmares. Today, her contemporary art gallery is thriving, more successful than ever before, filled with bright, welcoming light and sincere, honest success. Every Sunday morning, we sit together peacefully on the wide wooden porch, drinking rich, warm coffee, talking comfortably about everything, and yet, as if we are talking about nothing at all. On that unforgettable night, I not only miraculously saved the life of my beloved daughter, I also succeeded in pulling my absolute best friend back from the edge of a dark, dangerous abyss. Deep emotional scars inevitably take time to heal completely, but we are absolutely committed to walking that beautiful road of recovery side by side every single day. There is one very specific, deeply personal detail I must clearly mention regarding Dominic, the brilliant, incredibly insightful master tailor. It was he who physically shoved me into that narrow fitting room and forcibly demanded I listen to the horrifying truth. That brave, fundamentally kind man never needs to pay for another glass of wine or a decent hot meal in this massive city again. I have personally, absolutely ensured that one tiny, righteous, and incredibly important detail. Sometimes the vast, unpredictable universe suddenly hands you a profound, life-saving miracle, and it comes wrapped tightly in a terrifying, unbearable nightmare. When that incredibly rare moment arrives, you must never panic. You only need to remain perfectly quiet, listen carefully to the hidden, malicious whispers of your enemy, and meticulously prepare your decisive structural counterattack. For any incredibly loyal parent listening to my story right now, I urgently need you to remember one incredibly important, fundamental rule. Never let the temporarily paralyzing fear of pushing your child away artificially stop you from deeply trusting your ingrained, protective parental gut instinct. Dangerous, calculating, incredibly patient predators absolutely never arrive wearing obvious, flashing warning labels. They arrive perfectly disguised as everything your incredibly vulnerable child has ever wanted in their life. They skillfully weaponize overwhelming, seductive charm as a lethal weapon, and deliberately utilize brutal emotional isolation as their primary, destructive psychological tool. If a brand new, seemingly charming individual suddenly enters your intimate family circle, and the established dynamic becomes instantly dark and undeniably toxic, if your once vibrant, independent child changes their fundamental behavior and personality completely, do not just politely step back and quietly mind your own business. You must actively, aggressively investigate those threatening shadows. Ask those incredibly difficult, deeply uncomfortable, terrifying questions that no one else has the courage to ask out loud. Spending one difficult month being temporarily viewed as an unreasonable, paranoid, controlling villain in the eyes of your young, naive child is absolutely infinitely better than spending the absolute, endless remainder of your broken life, pathetically, helplessly mourning their completely avoidable death. If this incredibly specific, intense true story has clearly proven to you that the unyielding love of an incredibly protective father is the ultimate, indestructible shield against the absolute darkest evil in the modern world, please hit that like button right now. Subscribe to this channel today so you never miss hearing more incredible true stories about incredible survival, profound family bonds, and absolute, undeniable justice. Tell me exactly which specific city you are watching this video from in the comments section below. I genuinely love reading all of your incredible replies. We will see you formally in the next video. Stay absolutely safe out there. Oh yes, yes. I used to ride upon your shoulders and think that you could touch the sky. When I looked at the world through your eyes, every road seemed less filled with unknowns. You were stronger than the mountains, taller than the pines of the north. When the wild winds of winter blew, you would always stand between them and me. Time kept moving like a river, the years flowing slowly to the sea. But no matter where life leads me, you are always a part of me. I am my father's daughter. Every step that I take, every time that I choose to stand, when falling would have been so much easier, I carry your courage within my heart, burning your fire within my soul. Though the years keep on passing, your love still guides me back home. You taught me strength wasn't found in power, but in kindness during the hardest times. You taught me how to keep on going when the road turned cold and dark. Every lesson, every story, every laugh by the fireside remains like an echo deep within, softly calling out my name. When I face my greatest battles, when I feel I cannot go on, I can hear your voice right beside me saying, "Child, you are stronger than you know." I am my father's daughter. Every step that I take, every time that I choose to stand, when falling would have been so much easier, I carry your courage within my heart, burning your fire within my soul. Though the years keep on passing, your love still guides me back home. Someday the snow will cover the footprints. Someday the fire will slowly fade. But what a father gives to his daughter is something that never goes away. Not the gold, not the stories, not the battles that he won, but the way he quietly loved her and the woman she has become. I am my father's daughter, and I always will be. Through every triumph, every loss, through every joy and every pain. The world around me might change, the stars above might fade away, but I will carry with me always my father's endless love. If they ask me who I am, I will smile and softly reply, I am my father's daughter. I am my father's daughter.